With police brutality on the rise and recent murders of minorities like Mike Brown, Eric Gardner, and John Crawford III, many ask if things have truly changed in our society. Throughout decades, police have always had the objective of protecting property and enforcing the law. In 1829 in London, Sir Robert Peel and his police force had a goal to protect life and property. That philosophy has been passed down to other future police and have been used in different ways. But the origin of American policing dates back to the later days of the colonial period, an era of slavery. Law enforcement in America existed long before the Civil War. There are similarities between slave patrols and modern policing that is very comparable. Patrols were made to maintain the economic order and to help wealthy landowners in recovering slaves. Slaves in historical America was considered private property.
I think it's important there are two separate developments that I think become important. There's actually the development of police forces in the North, and then there's the development of police forces in the South. When we look at police forces, and largely the reason why these police forces develop differently is because of the slave trade. So in the North, which were free states, they didn't have the same rules and regulations as were laid in the South. So when you look at the South, you see police forces that were developed from slave patrols. These slave patrols, more grounded rights. Now they had police forces. Now you get police forces in the colonial period as early as the late 1600s, right? They were referred to as volunteer patrols or what have you. But as government started to develop, they actually gave these folks who were in the slave patrols in the South particular rights. And then they started to refer to them as police forces, right? So again, the transition from slave patrols to police forces is a dynamic that happens in the South. The development of police forces in the North are very different. But this eminence from slave patrols actually comes from the South.
In Baltimore, 1784, Boston, 1838, New York, 1845, Los Angeles, 1853, and San Francisco, 1849, the first police forces grew. But in my research, I would often get my sources conflicted on who created the first official police department. That was because law enforcement was around the colonial period, and there were different types of law enforcement in the country. Also, there were two separate developments in America, which were the North and the South. So the dates are numerous. They would stretch from early as 1700s to the 1860s.
So that group of folks who were not then known as slave patrols, they had a couple of responsibilities. One responsibility was to make sure that those who may have escaped were brought back to their owners by way of the structure of the law, because there were actually there's actually papers that had you that stated that you were bonded to your owners. And so in the South, in addition to catching those who were deemed runaways, there was also another set of rules and responsibilities that those slave patrols had. And the largest responsibility of that particular group was to make sure that you did not have access to the rights and duties of members of the ownership class. So these slave patrols were responsible to make sure that people didn't vote. If you had papers that noted your freedom, to make sure that they were not to be educated, they were not to read, they were not to write, they were not to build schools, and they were not to own land. Cities started to grow. Municipal governments started to figure out, okay, we need actually an arm of government that will protect our property. Now, this becomes important. I think this is really important in terms of the northern development of police forces. They are not first designed around the protection of people. They are centered in the protection of property first.
In pre-Civil War, in 1850s, around the same time big cities like New York and Chicago started to bloom. the Fugitive Slave Act was passed for a political compromise, saying that the North had to capture and return all runaway slaves back to the South. This was a close relation to the agenda of the slave patrols in the South. Cities like Chicago were significant to the funding of the police forces because of its size and its ability to globalize. Chicago had a swelling population of Irish immigrants, so naturally the Irish would become the Chicago's police force, even though Germans were the first. The Chicago police force was stated to be funded in 1835.
And there were certain people who were targeted for or recruited to engage those particular duties. So that became Irish folks in Chicago. The first set of white Western European folks who were police officers were actually German, right? And then it transitioned to Irish. And same thing in New York City. So right, there were British folks and German folks who were your members of your first police force, and then it transitioned to Irish folks much later, right? So this is the same thing in Boston, and the like, right? Because it was still considered working folk or lower class occupation because you really were protecting property, right? So this is or you were on property watch, right? So it wasn't a job that was held in high esteem. So when we look at the development of police in the South, we see many extensions of that, right? We see a lot of extensions of that, not just in terms of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Rekia Boyd, the young person who was shot at the playground in Cleveland. First name was Tamir. So these things are these unfortunate, tragic events, but I think they have to be understood as a longer legacy, right? It is understood as right and good to subjugate black bodies, right? The law tells us
more negative than it is positive. Like, so it's hard to get excited about a police officer coming around, especially if you're a person of color, because it's never been set up for a good thing for you. You know what I'm saying? And then, yeah, just throughout history, is nothing that has been really all that great. Like, there's a few things that you can point to that being like, oh, this is better, but for the most part, it's all kind of negative.
The use of slave patrols had a lasting legacy in America. But so what? Why is this important for us today? Well, throughout the Reconstruction era and Civil Rights Act of 1964, the harassment and police brutality of minorities stemmed from slavery. If we don't know our history, we are doomed to repeat it. With all the police controversy going on and the murders of Mike Brown and Eric Garner, we need to understand the past to solve the issues of today.
So it's like people being pat down. I'm talking about like this is the 90s where you have people being pat down, doing strip searches on the street, you know, and it's just like it's really bad conditions. And then over time, it's like people have to work extra hard to tell police what they're doing wrong. And yeah, so that's just a little bit of the history of how cops were first formed. But initially they were formed to be the first slave master, like the first slave catchers.
J Squad.